Hit record. My name is Frank Dirks, and I am with Carolina Catholic Professionals. And I am delighted today to have an opportunity to talk with Dr. Michael Trinkley, director of the Chicora Foundation. Dr. Trinkley has been the director of the Chicora Foundation since 1983. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina. And before he was at Chicora Foundation, he was with the South Carolina Department of Highways, leading their archaeological unit with the Highway Department. He consults broadly on archaeology and preservation. He's consulted before the South Carolina Circuit Court as well as the U.S. Federal District Court. He is an expert in the field of archaeology and preservation. Chicora is an organization specializes on this in the Southeast, and we are delighted to have Dr. Trinkley with us. So, Dr. Trinkley, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, sir.
Well, we're here really to talk about your work on the St. John Cemetery project. It was your report that really kind of prompted our interest in the preservation of St. John Cemetery. Obviously, we weren't the first. The Diocese of Charleston erected a fence and a sign here designating that cemetery, but it was really your work that prompted that. And looking forward to hearing your thoughts on it. But before that, tell me a little bit more about Chicora. I know I didn't do it justice.
No, you did fine for an introduction. Chicora is a non-endowed nonprofit. In other words, no one has left us $1 million, and so we operate on a cost recovery basis. And our program operates under a very broad preservation umbrella. We do archaeological investigations, historic research, in particular cemetery preservation, and also public education in schools and adult groups. And as you mentioned, we've been around for about 30 years. And the investigations we did at St. John's, we refer to it that way, but it's of course St. John's Burial Association, was a result of the church located there requesting more information about the cemetery and advice concerning how they might go about working into some agreement to ensure the preservation of the property.
If I could just jump in a little bit, when you say the church, you're really talking about Calvary Episcopal Church, which is right adjacent to that.
That's correct. And as you probably recall from the history, there have been efforts to subdivide the property for a very long time. Cemeteries have rarely gotten in the way of business activities in Charleston. There's a fairly long list of cemeteries that were almost lost or were in fact completely lost as a result of some sort of development or subdivision of the property. And that's what St. John's has faced in the past and faced in the 1980s as well.
So it was really the prompting of the Calvary Episcopal Church that brought you into this. I mean, how was this presented to you, and really how did you come to this effort?
Well, the pastor called up one day and said they were interested in ensuring the preservation of this cemetery, and that the Catholic Church, at least thus far, had not been interested in his outreach and was, according to him, intending to develop the property. In fact, one aspect of our report was that an engineering firm had already put in 6-inch borings across the site to see if they could actually prove that it was a cemetery through the recovery of human remains. And as probably many people will realize, that's a fairly aggressive approach, taking 6-inch augering to a burial ground. In spite of that, they didn't find what they were hoping to find, evidence of human remains. And we can talk about that's not terribly surprising when you want. But the pastor at St. John's Episcopal Church wanted some advice about how to go about contacting the Catholic Church and information that he could provide to them and negotiate with in terms of ensuring the preservation of that property. He felt at the time that the Catholic Church had not shown a great deal of interest in assuring a long-term preservation.
And this was in about 1993, 94, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And there's a burial ground associated with Calvary Episcopal too. If I recall, Jonathan Jasper Wright, who was the first African American state Supreme Court justice in South Carolina, is buried there. Is that right?
Well, we really did not do a whole lot of investigation regarding the Episcopal cemetery or the individuals that were in either cemetery. While that's, of course, of great interest to many people, our investigations rarely look at the individual burials. We're looking at the broad prospects, a broad overview of the cemetery and the broad historical features and characteristics of the owners.
Mm-hmm.
And one characteristic of most church owners is that the goal is to bury remains in sacred soil and to ensure that they stay there long enough for the bones to decompose. And then after that, many religions are not terribly concerned about converting the property to more secular uses. I suppose that the feeling is that the intent of a church burial had been achieved, and now that there was nothing recognizable left, or perhaps nothing more than a few coffin parts, that it was appropriate to convert the property to some other use. Now, as a preservationist, that's not really our philosophy, but it's frequently the philosophy of churches.
Yeah. So the pastor of Calvary Episcopal reached out to you. Now he was joined. In fact, he was kind of serving as an advocate for a number of the parishioners of St. Patrick Catholic Church. Is that correct?
He did not go into that kind of detail with me.
Yeah.
That may have been. He simply expressed that there was reservation on the part of the Catholic diocese to preserve the cemetery as opposed to develop it.
Yeah. Well, what did you find? How did you go about finding that?
Well, most of our research focused on the history of the property, because the one outstanding issue seemed to be, was there really a cemetery at this location? Were there really burials at this location? Could some area be found that did not contain burials that could be sold off? And we focused far more on the history than on attempting to go out and doing archaeological research. The reason for that is that historic research tends to be far more cost effective than field investigations. An hour in the archives is frequently far more productive than an hour in the field doing some sort of excavations. And so our goal was to find some boundaries, find evidence of the cemetery being present, tracing its history to ensure that it all had not been destroyed by development, because as your viewers may recall, that property went through several stages of development in the past. What you see today doesn't reflect what you would have seen in 1880, for example. So we focused on the historic research using primarily the Catholic Diocese archives, and we did very little field investigation, because once we identified the cemetery being present, we were not really concerned with doing a whole lot of boundary determination or a whole lot of grave by grave investigations. As I mentioned, it's expensive to do, and really the only effective way to do it is to engage in some sort of fairly intrusive activities, such as stripping the soil off to expose the grave stains. This is a perfectly wonderful way of identifying graves if you're planning on removing the cemetery. But as you can imagine, it distresses people to go by, distresses most people, to go by a cemetery and see archaeologists moving soil and appearing to destroy graves. So we chose to avoid that as much as we could, and effectively identified that the cemetery was present, and effectively demonstrated that it was very large, and incorporated essentially that entire lot that had not been built upon.
And you also found in the early 1960s, the highway department took possession of a corner of what had been the cemetery, and they did, do boring samples. But as you said, while they concluded that boring samples found no evidence of graves, your argument is that that's really not the way you test whether or not there are graves there.
Yeah, doing a 6-inch boring is not going to give you a great deal of information. The problem is both bone and wood at that point is going to be very friable, very fragile, and not likely to stand the rotation and the damage caused by any sort of boring. So that what you get up out of the soil is more likely than not to represent an amalgam, just everything churned together. Now, it might be possible to discover intact or relatively intact coffin hardware, but the odds are really against you doing that kind of investigation. If I were going to investigate the lot, I would never use any sort of boring. It's destructive. You can't put it back in the hole the way it came out. It gives you a very narrow-eyed view of what you're looking for. And it's, as a result, it's just not a very practical means of ensuring that you're not destroying a cemetery, much less even evaluating whether a cemetery is present. as I mentioned, really the only appropriate approach is to do broad stripping. Come in with a piece of equipment that can strip off the first foot of soil, getting down into the subsoil to determine whether you have the outlines of graves. And in Charleston, with sandy soils, those outlines are liable to be leached out to some degree, but they're still going to be recognizable. But again, people going past the cemetery and seeing large equipment are going to be distressed by that, and it's going to create a lot of public attention that generally you don't want to raise in that kind of situation.
So the boring samples that were done in the early 60s when they built the crosstown really didn't satisfactorily determine grave presence. But your examination of just the lot and the use of the lot through the archives, are you fairly confident that it's reasonable to conclude that that may have included a portion where graves are present?
Yes, I am. As you mentioned, the historical report and the field investigations were limited to walking the property. We discovered several stones that were still intact in the field, if you wish, the vacant property, and those stones were associated with sunken depressions, which are very clear indicators of a burial, because of course, lacking a vault, a burial goes in the ground, the wood box coffin slowly disintegrates, and the grave drops during the process of that disintegration. And so you're left with these little field of depressions. That's very characteristic of a cemetery. But it's particularly characteristic in association with the historic research.
And your research, while you were not able to successfully identify as many names as are likely buried there, you were able to come up with at least 181 or so, is that correct?
Yes, by looking through church records, we were able to identify a fairly sizable number of burials on the property. Unfortunately, that work was hindered by the loss of the Sacramento Register from, I believe, the 1880s forward, a certain period around the 1880s. The Catholic Church very dutifully recorded sacramental events, burials, christenings, and so forth. And that would have told us, or that would have given us, a much more complete list of names. But its absence, at least at the time of our study, prevented the list that we have in our report from being complete. But it's a real good first place to start. We included as many names as we could possibly come up with.
And you concluded that there could be as many of us as 1,000 souls whose remains are there. Is that correct?
Yes, because burial grounds had the tendency, particularly in Charleston, to be used and reused. That with limited available property, people would go back and rebury between graves, would bury in areas that were not considered prime areas to begin with, but allowed space for another burial. And so it's frequently found that these burial grounds literally have people stacked in them. space was at a premium in downtown Charleston, and it was difficult to find free ground for burial. And as a result, the burial grounds that were um, present and were sanctified tended to be used very frequently with great intensity.
And in your experience, working in this field, particularly in the southeast of the United States, how characteristic of this history and this experience of this African American cemetery is it with the broader African American historic experience, at least in terms of cemeteries?
How does it fit in terms of that broader?
Yeah, I mean, how is this characteristic of that experience in other communities? Is this unique? Is this, in terms of just kind of it's almost being lost to history?
Many aspects of the cemetery are, in fact, absolutely characteristic of other cemeteries. I just spoke about how in urban settings, cemeteries tended to be used and reused. I should have said that that's even more characteristic of African American cemeteries. It's also characteristic in the sense that, as I've mentioned, the Catholic Church felt that once an individual had gone back to dust and earth, that it was possible to reuse the burial grounds for other purposes. I don't know if that's the teaching today, but at that point in time, it was a fairly common approach among the Roman Catholic Church. And it was particularly the case at African American churches. African Americans had very few places to bury people with respect and dignity in downtown Charleston. And we frequently see these burials being built over, usually without any effort made to remove graves. The property was somewhat atypical in its location and its ownership and the way it gradually developed. There are a number of African American cemeteries in downtown Charleston, and few of them are preserved as well as this particular churchyard. They're further down the neck, they're in the prime business district, and they really tended to be heavily impacted by modern development. So finding this cemetery, if it should ever be made available for research, is an extraordinary property. I believe I recommended it potentially eligible for the National Register because of the class of individuals that were buried there. There are, of course, other African American cemeteries in Charleston. There aren't many, however, that are Roman Catholic, that are of that status, that level of professionalism. And there's an opportunity to study how African American people adapted to the urban experience in the cemetery. That's not an advocation for it being dug up, but should the cemetery ever be disturbed, we pointed out that it had a number of research potentials.
Well, one of the aspects of this particular cemetery is it was, as you know, the Immaculate Conception Catholic Church was built over top of a portion of cemetery with the permission of the African American, Catholic Burial Association. Basically, was de facto responsible for, maintaining the cemetery. But
Yes.
you know, an Immaculate Conception Church was standing as recently as 1974. So there were elements of that cemetery that were still present that late. Is that still consistent with you know, with other African American cemeteries that you've encountered?
Not consistent of African American cemeteries in rural areas. There's a huge pressure being put on rural African American cemeteries by development. They tend to be situated in areas that today are um, quite sought after for development. In an urban setting, everything is different. And as a result, this particular cemetery is of special interest, while there are other undeveloped African American cemeteries in Charleston. Uh, the portion under this church has probably been very well preserved since that church was built. And I didn't oversee demolition, but probably present if demolition was careful and didn't use a lot of heavy equipment. It's a group of people that we don't have a great deal of information about. In other words, we know a lot about the lives of enslaved African Americans working in fields. We even know a little bit about the lives of enslaved African Americans who were working in the plantation economy, doing things like sewing or housework. We don't, however, have a great deal of information regarding African Americans that were engaged in urban activities, whether they paralleled work on a cemetery or were starkly different. And as a result, when we find a relatively well-preserved urban African American cemetery, we as professional archaeologists and as professional historians, as preservationists, should do everything we can to ensure that that burial ground is kept intact and undisturbed.
Well, as you know, our effort, Carolina Catholic Professionals, is to really build and create an appropriate memorial park that remembers the souls whose remains are buried there, and also honors their faith in their God and their church. Is this, I mean, in your experience working in other communities, again in the Southeast, is this something that is unique? Are we reinventing the wheel, or is this something that you know, could serve as an example for other communities?
It's not reinventing the wheel. There are relatively few urban burial grounds recognized in any fashion. And I think it's always appropriate to include the names of as many people buried in a cemetery as possible. Even noting that there are people of unknown names, I think is important. The point being that nobody should be forgotten. And that's particularly true, I believe, amongst the enslaved African Americans, because they had so few opportunities in life. I think it's important to remember them in death. And I also have the position that sacred ground is not so easily disposed of as some churches would advocate. So my only input in a situation like you're describing is to ensure that the proposed monument, memorial, doesn't disturb any burials on the property. And after that is accomplished, I think it's an absolutely wonderful thing to memorialize those who were buried there.
Well, I should say too, that the span in which this cemetery operated was basically from the 1840s until the 1920s at the very least. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
So it's a fairly lengthy time period, but one that covers an awful lot of distinct and unique history in this city and in this region.
Yes, it does. The burial grounds, of course, began with the enslaved Catholics, continued through the period of freedmen and their oppression, and finally continued into the relatively modern era. Although even by the 1920s, there was nothing being done toward economic equality. There were, however, opportunities for African Americans to leave the South and go to areas that offered freer and more conducive work environments. So it has a very long history. It's also a history, I might add, about which we have little information when it comes to issues such as dietary provisions, the health of the individuals, indications of work that might be found in the skeletal material. So you have a period that archaeologists have, or bioarchaeologists have had very limited opportunities to study.
Well, as we proceed in our effort to honor these souls, is there any advice you would offer us, and anything that you would say to anyone who wanted to join us in this cause or support it, financially or in any other way?
Well, first, I think it's very important, as I mentioned, to ensure that any sort of memorial does not impinge on graves. And then once that's ensured, I would hope that the effort would receive very broad community support, because quite frankly, this isn't an issue of Catholicism versus Protestantism. It's not an issue that pits one moral doctrine against another. It involves the simple humanity of the people being buried there and of ensuring their long-term memory, of ensuring that they are not forgotten amongst both their people and all of the people in Charleston. So I really applaud the efforts.
Well, Dr. Michael Trinkley, I can't thank you enough for taking your time this afternoon to join us and to share your views and to let people know about the great work you did on that report nearly 30 years ago, shockingly. But we want to try to continue on the efforts that you started, and again, bringing a proper memorial to the souls whose remains are buried at St. John Cemetery. So Dr. Trinkley, thank you again very much for your time and the conversation.
Thank you, sir. I hope you have a great success with your campaign.